Libertarianism. Libertarianism is a political and moral philosophy that places individual liberty at the center of its worldview. It holds that people have the right to live as they choose, so long as they do not infringe upon the equal rights of others. Rooted in classical liberal traditions, libertarianism emphasizes personal autonomy, private property, voluntary exchange, and minimal government intervention in both economic and personal affairs. At its core, libertarianism begins with a profound respect for the individual as a moral agent. It views each person as the rightful owner of their own body, labor, and the fruits of their labor. From this basic premise flows the belief that coercion, especially when imposed by the state, is morally illegitimate unless it is used to protect individuals from force or fraud. In this sense, libertarians argue that the only just use of state power is defensive, not paternalistic or redistributive. Philosophically, libertarianism draws on thinkers such as John Locke, who argued that individuals possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Locke maintained that governments exist solely to protect these rights and must be limited by the consent of the governed. In the 20th century, Robert Nozick further developed this view in his influential book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where he argued against redistributive taxation and state-enforced welfare, famously asserting that such policies amount to forced labor. For Nozick and many libertarians, any action that takes resources from one individual to give to another, no matter how well-intentioned, is a violation of moral boundaries. Economically, libertarianism embraces free market capitalism as not only the most efficient system, but the most ethical. Voluntary trade, competition, and entrepreneurship are seen as natural extensions of individual freedom. Government regulation, by contrast, is often portrayed as an arbitrary intrusion that distorts markets and restricts personal choices. In this view, when people are left alone to pursue their own interests, they are more likely to innovate, create wealth, and cooperate in ways that benefit society as a whole. Socially, libertarians advocate for broad personal freedoms. They typically support freedom of speech, privacy rights, drug decriminalization, and sexual autonomy, regardless of whether such choices align with mainstream morality. The guiding principle is that adults should be free to make their own decisions without interference, as long as they do not violate the rights of others. This leads libertarianism to embrace some positions commonly associated with both the political left and right, depending on the issue. However, libertarianism is not without controversy. Critics often accuse it of being overly simplistic, idealistic, or blind to systemic inequalities. By focusing so heavily on non-coercion and self-ownership, libertarians are seen by some as ignoring the real-world consequences of poverty, discrimination, and unequal opportunity. For example, opponents argue that in a society with vast economic disparities, the ideal of voluntary exchange may be compromised. When someone takes a job under harsh conditions out of desperation, how free is their choice, really? Another major critique comes from those who believe the state has a moral duty to promote social welfare. From this perspective, redistributive taxation, public education, environmental regulations, and healthcare systems are not violations of liberty, but expressions of justice and collective responsibility. Libertarians often reply that while charity and mutual aid are desirable, they must be voluntary to be ethical. The question of the state itself also divides libertarians. Some, like minarchists, believe a minimal state is necessary to protect rights and maintain order, through courts, police, and national defense. Others, known as anarcho-capitalists, argue that even these functions can be provided through voluntary institutions and private contracts. This internal debate reveals the philosophical tension at the heart of libertarianism: how to balance the need for protection with the desire for maximum freedom. In summary, libertarianism is a bold and principled defense of individual freedom against all forms of coercion, especially by the state. It envisions a world where people live by their own judgment, engage in voluntary relationships, and take responsibility for their own lives. To its advocates, this philosophy is the purest expression of human dignity and autonomy. To its critics, it risks ignoring the complexity of social life and the moral imperative to care for one another through collective action. Whether praised as the guardian of liberty or condemned as a justification for inequality, libertarianism continues to provoke passionate debate about what it means to be free. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is a forward-looking and often controversial philosophical movement that envisions the transformation of the human condition through advanced technologies. At its core, transhumanism advocates for the ethical use of science and technology to enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities, ultimately aiming to overcome fundamental limitations such as aging, disease, and even death. It represents not just a set of technological aspirations, but a radical rethinking of what it means to be human. The philosophical roots of transhumanism trace back to the Enlightenment and the humanist belief in progress and rationality. However, it gained its modern identity in the late 20th century, with thinkers like Max More, Nick Bostrom, and Ray Kurzweil popularizing the term and outlining its goals. More than a mere technological optimism, transhumanism is a worldview that holds that humanity is a work in progress, unfinished, malleable, and improvable. Transhumanist goals often include a range of advanced possibilities: genetic engineering to eliminate hereditary diseases, brain-computer interfaces to enhance cognition, artificial intelligence to assist or augment decision-making, nanotechnology to repair tissues or eliminate pathogens at the cellular level, and life extension technologies to slow or reverse aging. The ultimate aspiration for many transhumanists is the development of post-human beings, entities who transcend current human limitations in ways we can barely imagine, potentially through uploading consciousness into digital substrates or merging with AI. The movement draws strength from real scientific advancements. CRISPR has made precise gene editing a reality. Neuralink and other neurotechnology companies are developing brain-machine interfaces. AI systems now routinely outperform humans in specific cognitive tasks. And in fields like biotechnology and robotics, the line between medical intervention and enhancement is increasingly blurred. Transhumanists argue that it is not only possible but morally desirable to pursue such enhancements, viewing human suffering, frailty, and death as problems to be solved, not merely accepted. However, transhumanism is not without serious ethical, philosophical, and existential criticisms. One major concern is inequality. If enhancement technologies are available only to the wealthy or privileged, the gap between the enhanced and unenhanced could deepen existing social divides, creating a new form of techno-elitism or even a genetic caste system. Critics argue that transhumanism risks turning the human experience into a consumer product, where worth and capability are measured by how augmented one is. Another concern is the potential loss of human identity. What does it mean to be human if we are no longer bound by our biology? Will post-human beings still possess empathy, creativity, or a sense of shared history? Some philosophers worry that in our quest to transcend human limitations, we might discard the very qualities that make life meaningful. Religious and spiritual critics often view transhumanism as a form of hubris, an attempt to play God or bypass the natural order. From this perspective, death, suffering, and limitation are integral to the human experience, and efforts to overcome them could have unforeseen consequences. Others fear the emergence of technological totalitarianism, where governments or corporations might exploit enhancement technologies to control or manipulate individuals. Yet, despite the risks, many transhumanists argue that the moral failure lies not in attempting to transcend our limitations, but in accepting them passively. If we have the tools to reduce suffering, extend life, and expand our potential, shouldn't we use them? Just as past generations embraced medicine, education, and democratic governance to improve the human condition, transhumanists see no reason to stop progress at the boundaries of our biology. In conclusion, transhumanism challenges us to rethink the boundaries of human nature and the ethical responsibilities that come with technological power. It is both a hopeful vision of human potential and a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of unchecked innovation. Whether one embraces or rejects transhumanism, it forces us to confront the profound question: how far should we go in the quest to become something more than human? Idealism. Idealism is a major school of thought in philosophy that asserts that reality is fundamentally mental, immaterial, or spiritually constructed. At its core, idealism challenges the notion that the external, material world exists independently of perception or consciousness. Instead, it posits that the mind and its ideas are the primary substance of reality, and everything we consider real is in some way dependent on the mind. This concept has deep roots in both Eastern and Western traditions. In Western philosophy, one of the earliest expressions of idealism can be found in the works of Plato. Plato argued that the physical world is only a shadow of a higher, non-material realm of perfect forms, or ideas. According to him, the things we perceive through our senses are merely imperfect copies of these eternal truths that exist in the mind or in a metaphysical realm beyond the physical. The idea gained a more radical and explicitly metaphysical form in the hands of 18th-century philosopher George Berkeley, whose famous dictum "Esse est percipi," to be is to be perceived, became a cornerstone of subjective idealism. Berkeley denied the existence of matter altogether, claiming that objects only exist as sensations or ideas within perceiving minds. He maintained that God is the ultimate perceiver, ensuring the continuity and coherence of the world even when no human mind is observing it. Later, German philosopher Immanuel Kant introduced a more nuanced, transcendental, version of idealism. Kant argued that while there may be a world that exists independently of us, the noumenal world, we can never know it directly. What we know, the phenomenal world, is shaped entirely by the categories and structures of our own mind. Space, time, and causality, for instance, are not features of the external world but forms imposed by the human mind onto experience. Thus, for Kant, the mind plays an active role in constituting what we take to be reality. German idealists such as Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Schelling, and especially Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel extended this line of thinking even further. For Hegel, reality itself unfolds as the evolution of a universal mind or absolute spirit. History, art, science, and human society are all seen as expressions of this unfolding spirit gradually coming to full self-awareness. In this view, individual consciousness is not isolated but part of a greater whole that drives the dialectical process of history and knowledge. Idealism is controversial for several reasons. First, it directly opposes materialism, the dominant view in contemporary science, which holds that consciousness arises from the physical brain and that matter is the primary substance of the universe. Critics argue that idealism downplays the apparent objectivity and solidity of the world, leaning too heavily on introspection and neglecting empirical evidence. From a practical standpoint, it also raises difficult questions. If everything is mental, then what accounts for consistency in physical laws? Why do we all seem to share the same external world? However, defenders of idealism point out that even in science, we never access matter in itself, we only interpret measurements, sensations, and data through the lens of perception and cognition. They argue that consciousness is the one undeniable reality. We can doubt the existence of the external world, but not the existence of our own experience. Furthermore, idealism often carries spiritual or ethical implications. If the mind is central to reality, then thoughts, intentions, and consciousness might hold greater significance than mere physical processes. This view can inspire a sense of unity, purpose, or moral responsibility that some find lacking in materialist frameworks. In summary, idealism offers a bold and deeply provocative vision of reality. It places the mind, not matter, at the center of existence and insists that the world we know is inseparable from the act of knowing. Whether viewed as a profound truth or a metaphysical overreach, idealism continues to provoke debate about the nature of consciousness, reality, and the limits of human understanding. Egoism. Egoism is a controversial and often misunderstood philosophical position that places the self, its interests, desires, and well-being, at the center of moral concern. In its broadest sense, egoism is the idea that individuals ought to act in ways that are most beneficial to themselves. While many ethical systems emphasize altruism, duty, or collective well-being, egoism unapologetically asserts that self-interest is not only natural but can also be morally justifiable, or even morally required. There are several distinct forms of egoism, each with different implications and degrees of controversy. The most common philosophical variants include psychological egoism, ethical, or normative, egoism, and rational egoism. Psychological egoism is a descriptive theory that claims all human actions are ultimately motivated by self-interest, even when they appear altruistic. According to this view, when people help others, donate to charity, or make sacrifices, they do so because it brings them satisfaction, avoids guilt, or enhances their social standing. In this sense, psychological egoism is not a moral claim but a psychological one, that humans cannot act unselfishly. While appealing in its simplicity, psychological egoism is widely debated and often criticized for being unfalsifiable. It tends to reinterpret any action as selfish by definition, which can make it circular and scientifically weak. Ethical egoism, by contrast, is a normative theory. It claims not that people always act in their own interest, but that they should. According to ethical egoists, each person ought to pursue their own good, and there is no moral obligation to place others' interests above, or even equal to, one's own. This does not necessarily mean harming others. Ethical egoists can believe that cooperation, fairness, and kindness are instrumentally valuable when they serve one's self-interest. What makes an action right, in this view, is not how it benefits others, but how it benefits the self. Rational egoism goes further, asserting that it is rational to act in one's own long-term self-interest. It posits that a rational agent should always choose the course of action that maximizes their own well-being over time. While it does not strictly deny the possibility of altruism, it views altruistic behavior as rational only if it aligns with self-interest. The most famous advocate of a modern form of egoism is Ayn Rand, whose philosophy of objectivism promotes rational self-interest as the highest moral purpose of life. For Rand, altruism, the self-sacrificial morality often upheld by religion or collectivist ideologies, is a vice, not a virtue. She argues that individuals should live for their own sake, neither sacrificing themselves to others nor expecting others to sacrifice for them. Her philosophy champions independence, personal responsibility, and achievement as moral ideals. Egoism, especially in its ethical form, has faced heavy criticism across centuries. Critics argue that it undermines the foundations of morality, which often require impartiality, empathy, and concern for others. If everyone were to act purely in their own interest, wouldn't this lead to conflict, exploitation, or a breakdown of trust? From a religious or communitarian perspective, egoism is often seen as morally corrosive, promoting selfishness at the expense of social harmony or spiritual growth. Furthermore, egoism raises deep ethical questions about duty, justice, and rights. For instance, if it is in my interest to break a promise or exploit someone who cannot retaliate, is that morally acceptable under egoism? The egoist might answer that acting unjustly often backfires in the long run, but that claim doesn't always hold. Ethical egoism, therefore, is often accused of failing to resolve classic moral dilemmas or to offer guidance in situations where one's interests conflict with the interests of others. Nonetheless, defenders of egoism argue that self-interest and morality need not be enemies. They contend that many social goods, peace, cooperation, mutual respect, are best achieved when individuals are free to pursue their goals and recognize that their flourishing often depends on healthy relationships with others. In this sense, a mature form of egoism may be less about selfishness and more about self-respect, autonomy, and personal integrity. In conclusion, egoism challenges deeply held moral intuitions by suggesting that the self should be the central concern of ethical life. Whether seen as a dangerous rationalization for selfish behavior or a bold affirmation of individual dignity and autonomy, egoism provokes essential questions about the nature of morality, responsibility, and what it means to live well. Like many controversial philosophies, its power lies not only in the answers it gives, but in the assumptions it forces us to question. The simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis is a provocative and increasingly debated philosophical idea that proposes our reality is not what it seems, that we may, in fact, be living inside a sophisticated computer simulation created by an advanced intelligence. In other words, the world we see, touch, and interact with, our entire universe, could be a virtual construct, much like an ultra-realistic video game, running on a substrate of computation far beyond our current comprehension. While the concept sounds like science fiction, it has been taken seriously by prominent philosophers, scientists, and technologists. The modern version of the simulation hypothesis was most famously articulated by Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom in a 2003 paper titled Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? Bostrom doesn't claim we are definitely living in a simulation. Instead, he presents a compelling logical trilemma: one of the following must be true. Civilizations tend to go extinct before developing the technology to simulate conscious beings. Advanced civilizations have the capability but choose not to run ancestor simulations. We are almost certainly living in a simulation. His reasoning hinges on the idea that if it becomes possible for a civilization to simulate entire worlds with conscious minds, and if they have any interest in doing so, then they would likely create many such simulations. The number of simulated conscious beings would vastly outnumber the real ones, making it statistically more probable that we are one of the simulations rather than one of the original beings. This hypothesis draws on advances in computing, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality. As our own technology moves toward creating immersive digital environments, it becomes less far-fetched to imagine a future in which simulations are indistinguishable from real experiences. Just as we can already simulate weather patterns, ecosystems, and simple organisms, future intelligences might simulate entire societies, or even universes, with digital agents who are unaware of their artificial nature. The philosophical roots of the simulation hypothesis stretch back to earlier thought experiments. René Descartes, in the 17th century, famously considered the possibility that a malicious demon could be deceiving him about the nature of reality. Later, George Berkeley argued that reality consists only of perceptions sustained by the mind of God. These ideas questioned the reliability of sensory experience, a key concern also found in the simulation hypothesis. If all our senses are simulated inputs, how can we trust them to reveal an external reality? The implications of this hypothesis are both staggering and unsettling. If we are in a simulation, then the laws of physics, the history we study, and the evolution of life are all programmed or emergent within a designed environment. Our universe could have been created yesterday, and we'd have no way to know, because our memories themselves could be fabricated code. Free will might be an illusion, suffering and joy could be the byproducts of an experiment or entertainment. This opens up troubling ethical questions about the morality of the simulators. Are they gods? Scientists? Children playing games? Skeptics argue that the simulation hypothesis, while intellectually fascinating, is ultimately unfalsifiable and speculative. There is currently no empirical evidence to support it, only philosophical reasoning, statistical probability, and analogies with emerging technologies. Critics say that just because something could be true doesn't mean it is, and the hypothesis verges on metaphysical storytelling rather than rigorous science. Others question its anthropocentric bias. The idea assumes that future civilizations would find it meaningful to simulate human lives, values, or histories. Why assume that future intelligences would be interested in ancestors at all, or that they'd simulate minds rather than just environmental models? Moreover, if simulations can nest within simulations, the hypothesis leads to a dizzying recursion. Simulated beings could themselves build simulations, creating layers upon layers of artificial reality. Despite these challenges, the simulation hypothesis has gained traction, especially in popular culture. Films like The Matrix, Inception, and Tron, as well as science fiction novels and television series, explore variations of this idea, often dramatizing the philosophical anxiety it provokes. What is real? Can we ever know? If we escape the simulation, what lies beyond? In conclusion, the simulation hypothesis is not just a speculative theory, it is a mirror held up to our assumptions about consciousness, reality, and technology. It invites us to reconsider the trust we place in our perceptions, the direction of scientific progress, and the nature of existence itself. Whether ultimately true, metaphorical, or absurd, the hypothesis provokes a fundamental philosophical question that has haunted humanity for centuries: is what we perceive truly all there is? Determinism. Determinism is a complex and often controversial philosophical doctrine that asserts that all events, including human actions, are ultimately determined by previously existing causes. In its strongest form, determinism suggests that given the state of the universe at a particular time, the future is fixed and unalterable. Everything unfolds according to immutable natural laws, leaving no room for genuine randomness or free will. At its core, determinism is rooted in a mechanistic view of the universe, one that became especially prominent during the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Isaac Newton, who revealed that physical phenomena could be described with precise mathematical laws, helped cement the idea that the universe might function like a vast clockwork mechanism. If the position and motion of every particle in the universe could be known at a given moment, then, in theory, everything that follows could be predicted with perfect accuracy. This notion is encapsulated in the thought experiment of Laplace's demon, a hypothetical intellect that, knowing all forces and positions of all items in the universe, could predict the future in its entirety. However, determinism is not a monolith, it comes in various forms. Causal determinism, the most well-known variant, asserts that every event has a cause and follows from it inevitably. Logical determinism, on the other hand, suggests that the truth of propositions about the future implies that the future is already fixed. Theological determinism argues that if a divine being knows all future events, then those events must necessarily happen. The implications of determinism raise serious questions about moral responsibility and human freedom. If all our decisions and behaviors are the result of prior causes, our biology, upbringing, environment, can we truly be held responsible for our actions? This tension forms the basis of the free will versus determinism debate, a central issue in philosophy, ethics, and even law. Some philosophers are compatibilists, believing that determinism and free will are not mutually exclusive. They argue that freedom can be understood not as the ability to do otherwise in an absolute sense, but as the ability to act according to one's desires and intentions, even if those desires are themselves determined. In contrast, incompatibilists hold that true free will cannot exist if determinism is true. Among them, hard determinists accept determinism and reject free will, while libertarians reject determinism to preserve the notion of free agency. Modern science has complicated the deterministic worldview. The advent of quantum mechanics in the 20th century introduced genuine probabilistic elements at the microscopic level, challenging the strict determinism of classical physics. Still, whether quantum indeterminacy has any meaningful impact on free will remains a matter of intense debate. Randomness, after all, does not equate to control or freedom. If our actions are the result of chance, we may be no more free than if they were determined. In conclusion, determinism confronts us with unsettling yet essential questions about the nature of reality, human agency, and moral accountability. While it offers a powerful explanatory framework, it also forces us to reconsider deeply held intuitions about choice and control. Whether one embraces, rejects, or tries to reconcile determinism with freedom, engaging with it reveals the profound complexity of what it means to be human in a causally ordered world. Free speech absolutism. Free speech absolutism is a provocative and polarizing philosophical stance that holds that freedom of expression should be protected without exception, regardless of the content, consequences, or potential harm caused by the speech. According to this view, any restriction on speech, whether by governments, institutions, or social norms, is a dangerous infringement on a fundamental human right and a slippery slope toward authoritarianism and censorship. Free speech absolutists argue that even the most offensive, false, or hateful speech must be legally and socially tolerated, because the alternative, deciding what speech is permissible, inevitably grants power to authorities who may misuse it. At the heart of this position is the belief that open expression is not just one right among many, but the foundation of a free and democratic society. Free speech, in this view, is essential for the pursuit of truth, the functioning of self-governance, and the protection of all other freedoms. Drawing from Enlightenment thinkers like John Milton and John Stuart Mill, absolutists often appeal to the idea of the marketplace of ideas, the notion that truth and progress emerge from the free exchange of competing views, even if many of those views are wrong or offensive. Mill, for instance, argued that silencing even one opinion robs humanity of either the truth or the opportunity to understand why an opposing view is mistaken. Free speech absolutism is most commonly defended in the context of political speech, but it extends further to all kinds of expression, artistic, religious, scientific, even speech deemed hateful or dangerous. Absolutists often stress that what is considered offensive or harmful varies widely across time and culture, and thus no authority can be trusted to draw the line objectively or fairly. To them, once a society begins to carve out exceptions, banning hate speech, misinformation, or blasphemy, it legitimizes censorship, empowers those in control to silence dissent, and erodes the very freedom it claims to protect. However, this uncompromising position is also highly controversial. Critics argue that total freedom of expression can enable real-world harm. Speech can incite violence, spread dangerous falsehoods, reinforce systemic injustice, or psychologically harm individuals and groups. The question critics pose is whether society can, or should, tolerate speech that directly undermines the rights or safety of others. In recent decades, debates about Holocaust denial, hate speech, racist propaganda, and online misinformation have intensified scrutiny of the absolutist position. Many liberal democracies, especially in Europe, have enacted laws that ban certain forms of expression, arguing that these limitations are necessary to protect vulnerable populations and social cohesion. Furthermore, critics note that the marketplace of ideas may not function as idealistically as free speech absolutists imagine. In practice, some voices are amplified more than others, and misinformation or extremist views can spread rapidly through social media, with devastating effects. Power dynamics, media monopolies, and algorithmic bias can all distort discourse, leading to environments where truth does not necessarily prevail. Some argue that without some boundaries, the loudest or most harmful speech can drown out reasoned dialogue and poison public discourse. Despite these concerns, free speech absolutists maintain that the long-term costs of restricting expression are greater than the harms caused by speech itself. They argue that bad ideas should be confronted through debate, not suppression, and that granting authorities the power to silence speech always risks abuse. History offers chilling reminders. Regimes that begin with limited censorship often expanded, targeting dissenters, minorities, and unpopular thinkers under the guise of public safety or moral order. In practice, very few legal systems adopt a truly absolutist approach to free speech. Even in countries like the United States, where the First Amendment offers broad protections, exceptions exist for incitement to violence, defamation, obscenity, and threats. Free speech absolutism thus functions more as a philosophical ideal than a legal reality, an uncompromising benchmark against which limitations are measured and questioned. Ultimately, free speech absolutism raises difficult but essential questions. Should all expression be allowed, no matter how dangerous or offensive? Who should have the power to decide what is acceptable? And what risks are we willing to accept in exchange for an unregulated discourse? While few people agree with the absolutist position in full, it continues to play a vital role in debates about democracy, human rights, and the boundaries of tolerance in an increasingly connected and polarized world. Time doesn't exist. The idea that time doesn't exist is one of the most counterintuitive and controversial claims in both philosophy and physics. It challenges our deepest assumptions about reality, experience, and even identity. At first glance, time seems so obviously real. We age, seasons change, events follow one another, and clocks tick. Yet many thinkers, from ancient philosophers to modern physicists, have argued that time may be an illusion, a convenient fiction, or a mental construct rather than a fundamental feature of the universe. Philosophically, the idea finds its roots in the work of Parmenides, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who claimed that change is impossible and that all being is one, eternal, and unchanging. For him, the idea of time implied change, and thus contradiction, since something cannot come from nothing or suddenly become what it was not. If change is an illusion, then so is time. Centuries later, St. Augustine famously wrestled with the concept in his Confessions, writing, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know, if I wish to explain it to one that asketh, I know not." He recognized that time seems real when experienced but elusive when analyzed. In the modern era, this skepticism took on new form with Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that time, and space, are not properties of the world in itself, but structures imposed by the human mind in order to make sense of sensory input. That is, we don't perceive time because it exists, rather, we experience the world as temporal because our minds are wired to organize events in this way. According to Kant, time is a necessary condition for human experience, but not something that exists independently out there. In the 20th century, the debate gained new energy from developments in physics. Einstein's theory of relativity introduced the radical idea that time is not universal, it dilates, stretches, and contracts depending on gravity and speed. This shattered the Newtonian conception of absolute time. In relativity, all moments in time, past, present, and future, are equally real in what is called the block universe model. Time is just another dimension, like space, and our experience of now is not a special moment in the universe, but simply a point along a timeline viewed from a particular perspective. This idea implies that time doesn't flow, the sensation of movement from past to future is an illusion created by consciousness. Some physicists, such as Julian Barbour, have pushed this idea even further, arguing that time is not a fundamental aspect of the universe at all. Barbour proposes that the universe is made up of a vast number of nows, or timeless configurations, like individual frames of a film. There is no motion from one frame to the next, only the appearance of motion when these static frames are viewed in a certain way by a conscious observer. In his view, what we call time is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of change, but change itself, and even causality, might be deeper than time. This notion is not without its critics. Many argue that denying the existence of time leads to contradictions or makes experience unintelligible. After all, if time doesn't exist, how do we explain memory, aging, entropy, or the apparent directionality of cause and effect? Our biology, psychology, and physics all seem to be deeply entangled with the notion of time. And practically, we live our lives by it, scheduling, planning, growing older. Still, some defenders of the idea argue that these objections only prove that time is a powerful mental model, not that it is ontologically real. They suggest that our perception of time may be like our perception of color, a useful interpretation of reality rather than a direct feature of it. Just as we perceive red or blue as qualities of objects, even though they're interpretations of electromagnetic wavelengths by the brain, perhaps past and future are perceptual constructs our minds create to navigate a world of change. In conclusion, the claim that time doesn't exist is not a denial of our experience, but a challenge to take a closer look at what time actually is. Is it a flowing river, a fixed dimension, a mental illusion, or something else entirely? While science and philosophy have not settled the debate, the question reveals just how much of our understanding of reality may be shaped not by what is, but by how we experience it. The more we study time, the more it begins to dissolve in our hands, familiar yet strangely unreal. Free will is an illusion. The idea that free will is an illusion is one of the most provocative and controversial claims in both philosophy and science. It challenges the deeply rooted belief that human beings are autonomous agents, capable of making independent choices and morally responsible for their actions. To say that free will is an illusion is not to deny that people feel as though they make choices, rather, it is to argue that this feeling is misleading, that our decisions are determined by forces beyond our conscious control. At the heart of this claim lies a clash between human intuition and deterministic reasoning. Most people experience their lives as a series of choices, deciding what to eat, whom to marry, whether to tell the truth or a lie. This subjective experience is often taken as evidence that we are in control of our actions. Yet, from a deterministic standpoint, especially in light of advances in neuroscience, psychology, and physics, this perception begins to unravel. Philosophical determinism holds that every event, including human thought and behavior, is the result of preceding causes governed by the laws of nature. If all of our actions are the inevitable outcomes of prior states of the universe, then, in principle, we could not have done otherwise. For example, if your decision to drink coffee this morning was the product of your brain chemistry, personal history, environmental stimuli, and genetic makeup, then the decision was not truly free, it was caused. Hard determinists, such as the 18th-century philosopher Baron D. Holbach and more recently, neuroscientist and author Sam Harris, argue that the sense of freedom we experience is an illusion generated by our lack of awareness of these causal chains. We are like passengers on a train who believe we are steering the engine, when in fact we are just along for the ride. The argument that free will is an illusion has gained traction in recent decades due to findings in neuroscience. In a series of now famous experiments conducted by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, researchers found that the brain shows signs of initiating an action before a person becomes consciously aware of deciding to act. More recent studies using brain imaging have supported this finding, suggesting that neural activity predicting a decision can be detected seconds before a person reports being aware of making that decision. These results seem to suggest that the brain decides before the conscious mind catches up, casting doubt on the idea that conscious will is the true origin of action. Critics of free will often appeal to psychology as well. Studies have shown that people's decisions can be subtly influenced by factors they are not aware of, framing effects, priming, unconscious biases, and more. These suggest that much of what we believe to be rational, autonomous choice is in fact shaped by forces we do not recognize, let alone control. The claim that free will is an illusion has profound implications for morality, law, and personal identity. If people are not truly responsible for their actions, can we meaningfully praise or blame them? What does justice mean if criminals had no real choice in their behavior? Some argue that our entire system of ethics and punishment must be rethought. Others respond that even if free will is illusory, consequences still matter. People can be influenced by rewards and punishments, so responsibility can be reframed in practical terms rather than metaphysical ones. Not all philosophers and scientists agree that free will is an illusion. Compatibilists argue that free will can exist even in a deterministic universe. According to this view, being free doesn't mean being uncaused, it means acting according to one's motivations, desires, and reasoning, without external coercion. In this framework, even if our choices have causes, they can still be meaningfully ours. Libertarian free will, the view that people can make truly undetermined choices, is still defended by some, particularly those who believe consciousness plays a non-material or indeterministic role in decision-making. Quantum indeterminacy, for instance, has been cited by some philosophers as a possible opening for non-deterministic free will. Although most physicists and philosophers remain skeptical that randomness would translate into meaningful freedom. In conclusion, the claim that free will is an illusion challenges the very foundation of how we see ourselves, as moral agents, as authors of our lives, as responsible beings. It forces a reckoning with the possibility that we are not as in control as we believe. Whether one ultimately accepts or rejects this view, engaging with it sharpens our understanding of choice, responsibility, and the complexity of the human mind. Even if free will is an illusion, the debate surrounding it is very real, and vital. Radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is a deeply unsettling and intellectually provocative philosophical position that challenges the very possibility of certain or reliable knowledge. Unlike ordinary skepticism, which may doubt specific claims or areas of inquiry, such as political spin or pseudoscience, radical skepticism asks a far more fundamental question: can we truly know anything at all? It casts doubt not just on particular beliefs, but on the entire structure of human knowledge, including our beliefs about the external world, other minds, and even the reliability of our own senses and reasoning. The roots of radical skepticism run deep in the history of philosophy. Ancient Greek thinkers like Pyrrho of Elis and later the academic skeptics questioned whether humans could ever attain objective knowledge, arguing that for any claim, an equally plausible counterclaim could be made. But perhaps the most iconic formulation of radical skepticism emerged in the 17th century with René Descartes, who famously set out to discard all beliefs that could possibly be doubted in order to find a foundation of certainty. Descartes' methodical doubt led him to question the evidence of the senses. What if everything he perceived was a dream? What if a powerful deceiver, malicious demon, was manipulating his thoughts, leading him to believe in a reality that didn't exist? In the face of these radical doubts, Descartes found only one belief he could not coherently doubt: cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Even if he were being deceived, the very act of doubting proved that something, namely his own consciousness, existed. Modern forms of radical skepticism expand on these questions. The brain in a vat thought experiment, for instance, asks, how do you know you're not just a disembodied brain wired to a supercomputer, fed illusions of a world that doesn't actually exist? Similar concerns arise from contemporary discussions about simulated realities, popularized in fiction such as The Matrix. If such scenarios are conceivable, and we cannot rule them out conclusively, how can we claim to know that our experience corresponds to reality? Radical skepticism also extends to the problem of induction, highlighted by David Hume. Hume questioned how we can justify our belief that the future will resemble the past, that the sun will rise tomorrow just because it always has. Since this belief relies on inductive reasoning, generalizing from past experience, and there is no non-circular way to justify induction itself, our confidence in cause and effect relationships rests on habit, not rational certainty. These skeptical challenges are not merely academic exercises. They strike at the heart of epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. If radical skepticism is right, then all claims to truth, scientific understanding, or even everyday beliefs might rest on shaky, unjustified grounds. This possibility disturbs our confidence in rational inquiry and raises difficult questions about the limits of human understanding. However, few philosophers fully embrace radical skepticism. Most see it as a challenge to be answered rather than a conclusion to be accepted. Several responses have emerged. Foundationalism, as in Descartes' case, seeks indubitable beliefs upon which other knowledge can be built. Coherentism argues that beliefs are justified not by foundational certainty, but by how well they fit within a network of mutually supporting beliefs. Reliabilism holds that beliefs can be justified if they are produced by reliable cognitive processes, even if we can't fully explain why those processes work. Contextualism suggests that knowledge claims are sensitive to context. While we might not know something under hyperskeptical scrutiny, we can still meaningfully claim to know it in everyday life. Some philosophers, such as Ludwig Wittgenstein and G. E. Moore, respond to radical skepticism by rejecting its premises altogether. Moore famously raised his hand and said, "Here is a hand," arguing that such basic perceptions are more certain than any skeptical argument that would call them into doubt. Wittgenstein suggested that doubting everything is incoherent. Because doubt itself presupposes a framework of trust and shared meaning. In conclusion, radical skepticism is a powerful philosophical force that compels us to examine the assumptions underpinning our knowledge and perception of reality. While few live as though radical skepticism were true, after all, we rely on sensory experience and memory every day, it remains a persistent philosophical shadow. Its value lies not in paralyzing doubt, but in sharpening our awareness of what it means to know, to believe, and to trust in reason. Whether we ultimately refute it, work around it, or learn to live with it, radical skepticism serves as a relentless test of the depth and resilience of human understanding. Just war theory. Just war theory is a long-standing and deeply influential framework in moral and political philosophy that seeks to determine the conditions under which engaging in war can be morally justified. Rooted in both religious and secular traditions, the theory offers a way to navigate the profound ethical dilemmas posed by warfare, an activity that involves violence, destruction, and often, large-scale loss of life. Rather than viewing war as inherently immoral or always permissible, just war theory attempts to provide a principled middle ground. War can sometimes be justified, but only under strict moral guidelines. The theory is typically divided into three main components: jus ad bellum, justice of war, which addresses the reasons for going to war; jus in bello, justice in war, which governs conduct during war; and more recently, jus post bellum, justice after war, which concerns how wars should end and how peace should be restored. Under jus ad bellum, a war is only considered just if it meets several criteria. First and foremost is just cause. The war must be fought for a morally acceptable reason, such as self-defense against aggression or the protection of innocent lives. Closely linked is the requirement of right intention. The goal must genuinely be the just cause itself, not ulterior motives like territorial expansion or revenge. Other key criteria include legitimate authority. Only duly recognized political bodies can declare war. Last resort, all peaceful alternatives must have been exhausted, and proportionality. The anticipated benefits of the war must outweigh the expected harms. Finally, there must be a reasonable chance of success, to avoid pointless or hopeless bloodshed. Even if a war is justified in its origins, jus in bello requires that it be fought morally. Two main principles govern conduct in war: discrimination and proportionality. Discrimination means that combatants must distinguish between legitimate military targets and non-combatants, never intentionally targeting civilians. Proportionality in this context refers to the use of force being limited to what is necessary to achieve military objectives. Excessive or wanton violence is prohibited. This component of the theory attempts to mitigate the horrors of war by setting moral boundaries even amid conflict. The third component, jus post bellum, is a more recent addition that addresses the ethical obligations that arise once a war has ended. This includes fair treatment of prisoners and civilians, just peace agreements, reconstruction efforts, and the prosecution of war crimes. The idea is to ensure that the end of a war leads to a just and sustainable peace, not to continued suffering or cycles of revenge. Despite its noble intentions, just war theory remains highly controversial. One criticism is that it can be too easily manipulated to justify almost any conflict. Governments often frame their wars in terms of just causes, even when the true motives are economic or political. The ambiguity in interpreting right intention or reasonable chance of success can lead to self-serving rationalizations rather than genuine moral scrutiny. Additionally, critics argue that the theory struggles to apply in modern warfare, where distinctions between combatants and civilians are increasingly blurred, and where technologies like drones, cyber warfare, and nuclear weapons raise new ethical challenges. Pacifists, for their part, reject the premise of the theory altogether. They argue that war, by its very nature, is incompatible with moral behavior and that efforts to regulate it morally are misguided. Others challenge the assumption that violence can ever lead to justice or lasting peace, pointing to the long-term devastation that even just wars leave in their wake. On the other hand, proponents of just war theory argue that abandoning moral standards in war is far more dangerous. In a world where conflict is sometimes unavoidable, having a framework to assess and limit the destructiveness of war is seen as not only valuable but necessary. The theory does not glorify war, it attempts to civilize it, to impose ethical discipline on one of humanity's most destructive impulses. Ultimately, just war theory remains a central, if contested, part of contemporary moral and political discourse. It reflects the human struggle to reconcile the realities of violence with the desire for justice, and the enduring hope that even in war, there can be room for ethics, restraint, and responsibility. Logical positivism. Logical positivism, also known as logical empiricism, was one of the most influential and controversial philosophical movements of the 20th century. Emerging from the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 1930s, it sought to bring the precision of mathematics and the rigor of the natural sciences into the realm of philosophy. At its core, logical positivism held that only statements that are either logically provable or empirically verifiable are meaningful. Any statement that fails to meet this standard, such as metaphysical claims, religious assertions, or moral judgments, is dismissed as cognitively meaningless. This radical stance was driven by a desire to cleanse philosophy of what logical positivists saw as centuries of confusion, speculation, and unverifiable metaphysical talk. Influenced by David Hume's empiricism, Immanuel Kant's distinction between analytic and synthetic truths, and the emerging logic of Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, the logical positivists believed that philosophy should function more like a science, dealing only with propositions that could be clearly defined and rigorously tested. The centerpiece of their doctrine was the verification principle. A proposition is only meaningful if it can be verified either by logical analysis, as in mathematics and formal logic, or by empirical observation, as in the physical sciences. For instance, the statement, "Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level," is meaningful because it can be tested and confirmed through observation. Similarly, "All bachelors are unmarried," is meaningful because it is analytically true by definition. In contrast, statements like, "God exists, the soul is immortal," or, "the universe has a purpose," were rejected by the logical positivists. These propositions, they argued, could neither be tested through experience nor proven through logic. Thus, they may express feelings, attitudes, or cultural sentiments, but they are not factually meaningful in the way scientific statements are. This position extended to ethics and aesthetics as well. For the logical positivists, moral claims like, "Murder is wrong," or aesthetic judgments like, "This painting is beautiful," were not statements of fact but expressions of emotion or attitudes, what later became known as emotivism. These statements do not describe the world, rather, they reflect how the speaker feels about it. This reduction of vast areas of human thought and culture to non-cognitive expressions caused significant backlash and remains one of the most criticized aspects of the movement. Despite its appeal to scientific clarity, logical positivism was plagued by internal contradictions and practical difficulties. Most famously, the verification principle itself could not be empirically verified or logically proven, a fact that critics quickly pointed out. If the principle is true, it fails its own test of meaningfulness, rendering itself meaningless. Moreover, many scientific theories involve entities or processes, like quarks or the Big Bang, that are not directly observable but are still considered meaningful within scientific practice. This raised questions about whether the verification criterion was too strict, excluding even legitimate science. Philosophers like Karl Popper proposed alternatives, such as falsifiability rather than verifiability, as the key to scientific meaning. Others, such as Willard Van Orman Quine, attacked the analytic/synthetic distinction, undermining a core pillar of logical positivism. By the mid-20th century, the movement had largely fallen out of favor, even among those who once championed it. Nevertheless, logical positivism left a lasting legacy. It revolutionized the philosophy of science, sharpened analytic philosophy's focus on clarity and argumentation, and influenced how language and meaning are studied in both philosophy and linguistics. Even as its core doctrine was discredited, its demand for rigor, its distrust of metaphysical speculation, and its insistence on tying meaning to observable reality remain influential. In conclusion, logical positivism was a bold attempt to ground human knowledge in a firm foundation of logic and empirical evidence. Rejecting centuries of abstract speculation as meaningless noise. Though ultimately undermined by its own standards and by philosophical counterarguments, it permanently reshaped the intellectual landscape. Its legacy is not in its conclusions, but in the sharp clarity it brought to the question, what does it mean for something to be meaningful at all? Might makes right. Might makes right is a provocative and controversial philosophical idea that suggests power, especially physical or political force, determines what is considered morally or legally right. At its core, this phrase implies that those who hold power, whether through violence, wealth, political influence, or coercion, get to define justice, truth, and social norms. In other words, moral authority is not based on ethical reasoning or fairness, but on dominance. This idea has appeared in different forms throughout history. One of its earliest expressions is found in Thrasymachus' position in Plato's Republic. In a debate with Socrates, Thrasymachus argues that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. According to him, rulers create laws not for the good of all but to serve their own interests, and then label those laws just. For Thrasymachus, morality is a tool of the powerful to maintain their dominance, not a universal standard. The phrase also echoes the worldview of realism in political philosophy and international relations, where power and self-interest are the primary forces shaping human affairs. From this perspective, moral ideals are secondary to the struggle for survival and control. States, leaders, and even individuals often justify actions, war, conquest, repression, not because they are just in any traditional sense, but because they can be accomplished and defended through force. What is right is often what can be enforced or imposed. Friedrich Nietzsche, a 19th-century philosopher, offers a more complex but related critique. In his genealogical analysis of morality, Nietzsche argues that traditional notions of good and evil were created by the weak to suppress the strong. He describes a transition from master morality, which values strength, power, and nobility, to slave morality, which exalts humility, obedience, and weakness. For Nietzsche, might makes right was closer to the original moral framework of human beings before it was inverted by religious and social systems that catered to the powerless. Proponents of this idea often argue from a cynical realism: history shows that power decides. Legal systems, borders, cultural norms, and hierarchies are often established not through democratic consensus or ethical argument, but by war, colonization, or the threat of violence. This view paints morality as a moving target, something that bends to the will of those who can enforce it. In this light, ideals like justice, equality, or human rights may be seen as comforting illusions used to mask the reality of power dynamics. However, the idea that might makes right is also widely condemned. Critics argue that it undermines the very foundation of ethical thought by reducing morality to brute force. If power determines right, then any atrocity, slavery, genocide, oppression, could be justified simply because it was carried out by the victorious. This view leads to moral relativism in its most dangerous form, where there are no universal standards of good or evil, only the preferences of the strong. Moreover, opponents argue that this concept erodes trust and legitimacy in governance and law. If laws are seen as tools of the powerful rather than expressions of shared values or fairness, then people are more likely to become disillusioned, resist authority, or turn to violence themselves. Societies cannot function stably if justice is perceived as nothing more than the whims of those in control. Modern democratic ideals and human rights frameworks are, in many ways, designed to reject the logic of might makes right. They strive to establish principles, such as equality before the law, due process, and the dignity of the individual, that transcend power structures. Yet even today, the tension remains. When powerful nations intervene in weaker ones, when corporate interests bend regulations, or when authoritarian regimes suppress dissent, the phrase reasserts itself as a grim commentary on reality. In conclusion, might makes right is less a philosophical principle than a lens through which to understand the relationship between power and morality. It is unsettling because it describes how the world often works, rather than how we believe it ought to work. Whether accepted as hard truth or rejected as a dangerous fallacy, the phrase forces us to confront the uneasy question: is morality created through reason and consensus, or is it written by the victors? Open individualism. Open individualism is a rare and deeply provocative philosophical view of personal identity that proposes that there is only one subject of experience, one consciousness, that is shared by all beings across all time. According to this theory, while people may appear to be distinct individuals with separate minds and bodies, in reality, you are every person who has ever lived, is living, or will ever live. There is just one observer, experiencing life through countless windows. This view stands in stark contrast to the more common sense and widely accepted view known as closed individualism, which holds that each person is a distinct, self-contained consciousness with a unique beginning, birth, and end, death. There's also empty individualism, a third view which posits that personal identity is momentary, essentially, that the self only exists for a fleeting instant and is replaced from moment to moment like frames in a film. Open individualism, however, makes the radical claim that personal identity is universal and unchanging, even as it expresses itself through an ever-shifting variety of bodies and minds. One of the most famous modern advocates of open individualism is Daniel Kolak, who developed the idea in his book I Am You. Kolak argues that despite our apparent separateness, all conscious beings are fundamentally one and the same experiencer. In his formulation, identity is not tied to memories, personality, or biology, but to the underlying capacity for consciousness itself. In this sense, your consciousness and mine are not just similar, they are identical. We are different expressions of the same awareness, temporarily identified with different perspectives. To grasp open individualism, one can imagine putting on a virtual reality headset that fully immerses you into someone else's life, memories, and body. In this metaphor, you might completely forget that you ever had another identity, and believe you are this new person. According to open individualism, this is what consciousness is doing constantly, but on a massive scale, temporarily identifying with different perspectives while always remaining, at its core, the same observer. This idea draws some implicit support from religious and mystical traditions. Certain interpretations of Hinduism, particularly Advaita Vedanta, hold that the true self, Atman, is identical with the universal consciousness, Brahman. Buddhist philosophy also questions the existence of a fixed, individual self. Many mystical experiences reported throughout history describe a loss of ego and emerging with all of existence, which resonates strongly with the perspective of open individualism. The implications of this idea are staggering, and highly controversial. If taken seriously, it collapses the distinction between self and other. If you are every person, then harming another is, in a very literal sense, harming yourself. Likewise, acts of kindness and compassion are not altruism, but forms of self-care spread across different masks of the same being. The ethical ramifications are profound. How would society change if everyone believed they were all, fundamentally, the same consciousness in different forms? Critics argue that open individualism is counterintuitive and speculative. It challenges deeply rooted intuitions about personal identity, memory, and responsibility. If everyone is the same person, then how do we account for moral accountability, justice, or the continuity of personality? Moreover, the theory relies on a metaphysical assumption about consciousness that is difficult, perhaps impossible, to prove empirically. It walks a fine line between philosophy and mysticism, and is often dismissed by those who view consciousness as a product of individual brains rather than a shared phenomenon. Despite its controversial status, open individualism continues to attract interest from philosophers, neuroscientists, and those engaged in psychedelic or contemplative practices, where the boundaries of the self are often blurred or dissolved. It serves as a radical reminder that our sense of being a separate self might be more fragile, and more illusory, than we typically assume. In conclusion, open individualism proposes that behind the multiplicity of faces, names, and stories in the world, there is only one experiencer, one I, wearing every mask. Whether this is viewed as an absurd fantasy or a glimpse into a deeper metaphysical truth, the idea challenges us to rethink not just what it means to be someone, but what it means to be anyone at all. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a classic and enduring philosophical thought experiment that raises deep questions about identity, change, and continuity over time. At its heart, it asks, what makes something the same object if all of its parts are gradually replaced? The thought experiment has fascinated philosophers since ancient times and continues to spark debate in fields as diverse as metaphysics, psychology, law, and even personal identity. The story goes like this. The mythical Greek hero Theseus had a ship that was preserved by the people of Athens as a monument. Over time, as the ship aged, its wooden planks began to rot. One by one, these planks were removed and replaced with new ones until, eventually, none of the original material remained. This raises the central philosophical question: is the fully restored ship, composed entirely of new parts, still the same ship of Theseus? At first glance, it seems reasonable to say yes. After all, the changes happened gradually and were made with the intention of preservation. The ship still looks and functions the same, and it retains its historical identity in the minds of those who maintained it. This intuition aligns with how we often think about personal identity. We accept that people grow, change, and physically replace most of their body's cells over time, yet we still consider them the same person. But the thought experiment doesn't stop there. A second, more complicated twist asks, what if all the original planks that were removed were saved and reassembled into a new ship? Now there are two ships, one made entirely of new materials and the other made entirely of the original components. Which one is the true ship of Theseus? The one that has historical continuity and was repaired piece by piece, or the one that contains the original physical parts? This conundrum forces us to examine what we mean by identity. Is it tied to material composition, continuity of form, function, or historical and narrative coherence? Philosophers have approached the problem in different ways. Essentialists might argue that there is a core essence of the ship that goes beyond its physical parts. If the purpose and structure remain intact, the identity remains as well, even if the parts change. Materialists, on the other hand, might claim that the ship's identity is based on its physical substance, so the ship reassembled from the original planks is the true ship of Theseus, because it contains the actual historical material. Relational or psychological theorists, in analogy to personal identity, might focus on continuity and perception. The ship that remained docked in Athens and underwent gradual repairs is the one people treated as the original, and so it maintains its identity through historical and social continuity. The Ship of Theseus isn't just about boats. It's a metaphor for personal identity as well. You, like the ship, change over time. Your cells die and regenerate, your memories fade or shift, your beliefs evolve. Are you still the same person you were as a child? If so, why? Is it because of your body, your consciousness, your memories, or something else entirely? In modern contexts, the problem also arises in technology and legal theory. For instance, if you replace every part of a car over time, is it still the same car? If a company rebrands and replaces all its employees and operations but keeps its name, is it still the same company? In digital identity, if you upload a mind to a computer and simulate consciousness with artificial neurons, is the resulting entity you? The Ship of Theseus invites us to confront the paradoxes of continuity and identity. How can something change and yet remain the same? It forces us to think about identity not as a fixed essence, but as something more fluid, perhaps even socially or contextually defined. In conclusion, the Ship of Theseus is not just a puzzle about a boat, it is a profound inquiry into what it means for anything, or anyone, to persist through change. It challenges our assumptions about sameness, replacement, and time. Whether applied to objects, people, organizations, or minds, it continues to push us toward a deeper understanding of identity in an ever-changing world. Eliminative materialism. Eliminative materialism is a bold and unsettling theory in the philosophy of mind that challenges many of our deepest assumptions about human consciousness. It proposes that many of the mental concepts we use every day, such as beliefs, desires, intentions, and feelings, do not refer to anything real and should eventually be discarded as science progresses. According to this view, our common-sense understanding of the mind, often called folk psychology, is a flawed and outdated theory, comparable to how pre-scientific cultures once explained illness through spirits or astronomy through celestial myths. Just as those earlier frameworks were abandoned in favor of more accurate scientific accounts, eliminative materialists argue that our current way of talking about mental states will one day be replaced by a neuroscientific vocabulary that better reflects the physical processes occurring in the brain. The core of eliminative materialism lies in a radical form of physicalism, the belief that everything about the mind can ultimately be explained in terms of physical processes. Unlike more moderate materialist positions, which try to reduce mental states to neural states, e.g., saying that pain is nothing more than C-fiber activation in the brain, eliminative materialists suggest that many of these mental states may not exist at all. They are not real entities or processes that will be mapped onto brain states one day. Instead, they are part of a fundamentally flawed conceptual framework. The most prominent advocates of this theory, such as Paul and Patricia Chitchland, argue that neuroscience is revealing a level of complexity and specificity in the brain that folk psychology is simply unequipped to describe. As our understanding of the brain improves, they claim, it will become increasingly clear that concepts like belief or fear are too vague, simplistic, and misleading to survive. This position is controversial for several reasons. First, it directly contradicts our everyday experiences. Most people feel that they do, in fact, have beliefs, desires, and emotions. We say things like, "I believe it will rain," or "I'm afraid of spiders," without hesitation. Eliminative materialism seems to undermine this basic introspective certainty by suggesting that these feelings are not what we think they are, or perhaps don't exist in any meaningful sense. Some critics argue that this makes the theory self-refuting. If there are no beliefs, then eliminative materialists themselves can't believe in their own theory. Others point out that folk psychology, while not scientifically rigorous, is remarkably successful in everyday life. We use it constantly to explain and predict behavior, to raise children, to write literature, and to interact socially. Dismissing it entirely, critics argue, is not only philosophically extreme but practically absurd. Despite these criticisms, eliminative materialism draws attention to a legitimate issue, the possibility that our mental concepts are not sacrosanct. Throughout history, many seemingly obvious ideas, like the geocentric model of the universe or the existence of phlogiston, have been overturned by scientific progress. Eliminative materialists ask us to consider whether the same might happen to our understanding of the mind. As neuroscience becomes more precise, revealing the intricacies of neural circuits, synaptic processes, and brain chemistry, we may find that the language of thoughts and feelings is simply inadequate. Future science might describe mental processes in terms entirely foreign to us, just as modern physics describes the world in terms unimaginable to pre-scientific thinkers. Ultimately, eliminative materialism is not widely accepted, but it occupies an important space in philosophical discourse. It challenges us to scrutinize the assumptions underlying our conception of the mind and to consider how scientific advances might force us to revise, or even abandon, the ways we think about thinking itself. Whether or not eliminative materialism turns out to be correct, it serves as a powerful reminder that even our most intimate self-understandings are not immune to revision, and that the mind may still hold many secrets science has yet to uncover. Inverted qualia. Inverted qualia is a thought-provoking and controversial concept in the philosophy of mind, particularly within discussions about consciousness and the nature of subjective experience. The idea poses a fundamental challenge to our understanding of how mental states relate to physical processes and raises deep questions about the limits of objective knowledge when it comes to the inner lives of others. At its core, the notion of inverted qualia suggests that it is possible for two people to have functionally identical experiences, that is, they behave the same, use the same language, and respond to stimuli in the same way, while their subjective experiences, or qualia, are fundamentally different. For instance, imagine two individuals, Alice and Bob, who both look at a ripe tomato. Both say it's red, both stop at red traffic lights, and both identify red things correctly in every context. However, the way red appears to Alice in her mind, the subjective experience she has when seeing red, might be what Bob experiences when he sees green. In other words, their internal color experiences are systematically inverted, but this inversion is undetectable from the outside because their behaviors are identical. This idea becomes especially intriguing and perplexing when applied to a broader range of qualia, such as tastes, sounds, or pains. Could one person's experience of pain feel like another person's experience of mild discomfort, even though both call it pain and act accordingly? The thought experiment doesn't claim that this is actually happening, rather, it challenges whether it could be happening without our being able to tell. If it's possible, it raises serious questions about the relationship between brain states and conscious experience. One of the central philosophical motivations behind the inverted qualia argument is to highlight the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. Even if neuroscience can tell us everything about how the brain processes color wavelengths or pain signals, it seems to leave unanswered the question of what it is like to experience red, or pain, or bitterness. This what it's like quality, often called phenomenal consciousness, is what qualia refer to, and inverted qualia challenges the assumption that these experiences are fully determined by physical or functional states. This has led some philosophers to argue that functionalist theories of mind, which define mental states entirely in terms of their causal roles and behavioral outputs, are inadequate. If two functionally identical beings can have different qualia, then consciousness cannot be explained purely in terms of input-output systems or brain states. Others have used inverted qualia to support dualism or property dualism, the view that mental phenomena are non-physical and cannot be reduced to material processes. For them, qualia are evidence that consciousness is something over and above the physical world. Critics of the inverted qualia thought experiment often argue that it relies too heavily on intuition and imagination rather than empirical evidence. They contend that if two systems are physically and functionally identical, then their experiences must be the same, even if we cannot access or compare those experiences directly. From this perspective, inverted qualia is an epistemic illusion, an apparent possibility created by the privacy of consciousness, not a real metaphysical problem. Some physicalists argue that if we knew enough about the brain, we would see that qualia are fully determined by physical facts, and the idea of inverted qualia would be incoherent. Despite these criticisms, inverted qualia remains an influential and enduring idea in the philosophy of mind. It serves as a powerful challenge to reductive theories of consciousness and underscores the persistent mystery of subjective experience. Whether taken as a serious metaphysical possibility or a provocative mental exercise, the concept invites us to reflect on the limits of scientific explanation, the nature of personal experience, and the profound difficulty of knowing what it is truly like to be someone else. Moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is a provocative and deeply unsettling philosophical position that challenges some of the most fundamental assumptions of human morality. At its heart, moral nihilism is the view that there are no objective moral facts or truths. According to this perspective, moral claims, such as, murder is wrong, or, one ought to be kind, are not statements of fact but expressions of subjective preferences, emotions, or social conventions. In the most radical form, moral nihilism suggests that all moral talk is ultimately meaningless or illusory. To understand moral nihilism, it helps to contrast it with more familiar moral theories. Traditional ethical systems, such as utilitarianism, deontology, or virtue ethics, assume that some moral claims are objectively true or at least rationally justifiable. They presuppose that concepts like good, evil, duty, or justice refer to real features of the world or at least valid standards of behavior. Moral nihilists reject this assumption. They argue that there are no such things as moral facts in the way there are physical facts, like the boiling point of water or the mass of the earth. As a result, they contend, moral judgments are not true or false in any meaningful sense. One of the most well-known proponents of moral nihilism was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, though he did not use the term explicitly. Nietzsche famously declared that God is dead, a metaphorical way of expressing the collapse of traditional moral and religious frameworks in the modern era. With the death of these foundations, Nietzsche argued, humanity faces a moral vacuum, an abyss, in which the values that once guided behavior no longer hold authority. For Nietzsche, this recognition was both liberating and dangerous. It opened the door to the possibility of creating new values but also to despair, nihilism, and the loss of meaning. Philosophically, moral nihilism can be broken down into several subtypes. One important variant is error theory, associated with philosopher J. L. Mackie. According to error theory, people often speak and think as if there are objective moral truths, but they are mistaken. Our moral discourse is built on a fundamental error, the belief that moral claims describe facts about the world. In reality, says Mackie, no such facts exist. Thus, while our moral language might be grammatically correct, it is semantically empty. Another variant is expressivism or non-cognitivism, which holds that moral statements do not aim to describe facts at all. Instead, they express emotions, attitudes, or commands. Saying, stealing is wrong, is not a factual claim but more akin to saying, boo to stealing, or don't steal. This approach avoids some of the metaphysical issues raised by error theory but still denies that moral judgments are objectively true. The implications of moral nihilism are both profound and disturbing. If no moral claims are true, then what becomes of justice, human rights, or ethical obligation? Can we condemn genocide, slavery, or cruelty if such condemnations have no factual basis? Critics of moral nihilism argue that it leads to moral paralysis or even an endorsement of immoral behavior. They fear that without a belief in moral truth, society loses its ability to hold people accountable or to justify resistance against oppression. However, defenders of moral nihilism often respond that the absence of objective morality does not necessitate apathy or chaos. Human beings can still construct ethical systems based on shared goals, emotions, or practical needs. We can still care about suffering, fairness, or cooperation, not because these values are true, but because they matter to us as sentient beings living together in a complex world. In this way, some moral nihilists embrace a kind of pragmatic ethics, where values are seen as useful human inventions rather than eternal truths. In conclusion, moral nihilism stands as one of the most radical challenges to conventional moral thought. It invites us to question the foundation of our ethical beliefs and to confront the possibility that morality, far from being a universal guide, might be a human-made illusion. Whether one rejects or accepts this conclusion, grappling with moral nihilism forces a deeper inquiry into what morality really is, why we believe in it, and what it means to live a meaningful life in a world that may be, at its core, ethically indifferent. Objectivism. Objectivism is a bold and controversial philosophical system developed by Russian-American writer and philosopher Ayn Rand in the 20th century. At its heart, objectivism asserts that reality exists independent of consciousness, that reason is the only means of acquiring knowledge, that individual rights and rational self-interest are the proper basis for ethics, and that laissez-faire capitalism is the only moral social system. Rand introduced her philosophy primarily through her novels, especially The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, but later articulated it in more formal philosophical essays and lectures. The foundation of objectivism lies in metaphysical realism. Rand insisted that existence exists and that reality is what it is, independent of anyone's beliefs, feelings, or wishes. In contrast to relativism or subjectivism, objectivism holds that there is an objective reality and that human beings can know it through the use of reason. For Rand, reason is not just one possible way of understanding the world, it is the only valid one. Emotions, faith, or intuition may provide insights into our internal states, but they cannot serve as tools for gaining knowledge about the external world. From this view of reason arises objectivist epistemology, which maintains that human knowledge is formed by a process of logical integration of the evidence provided by the senses. Concepts, in Rand's system, are not arbitrary labels but precise mental tools formed through abstraction and measurement omission. She was adamantly opposed to skepticism, mysticism, or any philosophical system that cast doubt on the reliability of reason. In ethics, objectivism takes a stance that many find especially provocative. It upholds the morality of rational egoism, the idea that the highest moral purpose of one's life is the pursuit of one's own happiness. This does not mean indulgence in whims or the sacrifice of others, but a disciplined, principled dedication to one's own rational values. Rand rejected altruism, not in the sense of kindness or generosity, but as a moral code that demands self-sacrifice for the sake of others. In her view, such ethics undermine individual dignity and reduce people to servants of others' needs. Virtue, in objectivism, is found in independence, integrity, productivity, and pride. This ethical framework leads directly into Rand's political philosophy, which champions individual rights, especially property rights, as the foundation of a free and just society. She argued that the only proper role of government is to protect these rights through the police, the courts, and national defense. Any attempt by the state to redistribute wealth, regulate industry, or impose moral codes, Rand viewed as a violation of individual liberty and a form of coercion. She condemned collectivist ideologies, whether socialism, communism, fascism, or modern welfare statism, as morally corrupt and politically tyrannical. In her view, laissez-faire capitalism, a system of free markets and voluntary trade, is the only economic system compatible with human freedom and moral dignity. Objectivism also contains a distinctive aesthetic theory, which sees art as a selective recreation of reality according to an artist's values. For Rand, great art shows things as they might and ought to be, reflecting a heroic vision of life. Her literary style, especially in Atlas Shrugged, embodies this approach, featuring larger-than-life protagonists who embody her ideals of rationality, independence, and defiance against collectivist conformity. Objectivism has had a polarizing impact on American and global intellectual culture. Admirers praise Rand's fierce defense of individual rights, her unapologetic valorization of human achievement, and her moral justification for capitalism. Her work has inspired generations of entrepreneurs, policymakers, and thinkers who see her as a rare voice defending freedom in an age of moral and political compromise. Critics, however, argue that objectivism is rigid, overly individualistic, and blind to social complexity. Many accuse Rand of promoting selfishness at the expense of compassion, or of offering a worldview that favors the privileged while ignoring structural inequalities. Philosophers from both analytic and continental traditions have often dismissed her work as lacking rigor or academic depth, though her defenders counter that her clarity and accessibility are strengths rather than weaknesses. In conclusion, objectivism is a comprehensive, systematic philosophy that celebrates reason, individualism, and capitalism as moral absolutes. Whether regarded as a visionary defense of human potential or a dangerously reductive ideology, it provokes intense debate about the nature of morality, the role of government, and the meaning of a good life. For those willing to grapple with its demands, objectivism offers a bracing, uncompromising vision of what it means to live by the judgment of one's own mind. Accidental universe. The accidental universe is a controversial philosophical and cosmological idea that suggests our universe, and everything within it, including life, consciousness, and physical laws, exists not because of a deeper purpose or design, but as a mere accident. According to this view, the universe has no inherent meaning or necessity, it simply is, the result of random processes, blind chance, or statistical inevitability across an unfathomably large or infinite multiverse. There is no guiding intelligence, no preordained plan, just a cosmos that happened to fall into the particular configuration we inhabit. This idea flies in the face of centuries of religious, metaphysical, and teleological traditions that assume the universe is ordered, meaningful, and crafted with intent. From ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle to the theologians of monotheistic religions, many have believed that the structure and elegance of the universe point to a purposeful creator or a rational, necessary order. The accidental universe, by contrast, strips away these assumptions and forces a re-examination of humanity's place in the cosmos. One of the central reasons this idea has gained traction in recent decades is the emergence of fine-tuning arguments in physics. Modern cosmology has revealed that the universe's fundamental constants, such as the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, or the cosmological constant, are finely tuned to allow for the existence of galaxies, stars, chemistry, and life. If these values were even slightly different, the universe as we know it would not exist. For some, this points to design. But the accidentalist counterargument suggests that if there are countless other universes, as posited by multiverse theories, each with different parameters, it's not surprising that at least one would end up being life-permitting. We simply find ourselves in that lucky universe, because it's the only kind we could find ourselves in. This view is closely related to the anthropic principle, which states that the universe must be compatible with conscious life, because we are here to observe it. It's a tautological but powerful idea. We can only ask why the universe allows life because it already does. There may be countless lifeless universes that fail to produce observers, and we wouldn't know anything about them because we couldn't exist in them. From this perspective, the universe's appearance of design is not evidence of purpose, but a selection effect. The conditions for life seem special only because, in all the failed universes, no one is around to ask the question. Philosophically, the accidental universe intersects with existentialism and naturalism, both of which emphasize the lack of inherent meaning in the universe and the need for humans to create their own values. If everything, including our own consciousness, is the result of cosmic fluke rather than fate or design, then there is no objective reason why we are here, no destiny to fulfill, no moral order written into the cosmos. This conclusion can be disorienting or even frightening, especially to those raised with the belief that life has a higher or divinely ordained purpose. Yet for some, the accidental universe is not a source of despair but of awe. The improbability of existence itself, the chance arrangement of laws and particles that somehow gave rise to stars, planets, and sentient beings, is seen as breathtakingly miraculous, even if there's no miracle worker behind it. The absence of design does not mean life is meaningless, it may mean meaning is something we must construct for ourselves. This is a central theme in much of modern secular humanism. We are the product of chance, but we can live deliberately. Still, critics of the accidental universe argue that it rests on speculative cosmology, particularly the unproven existence of a multiverse. Some also argue that invoking chance to explain fine-tuning avoids rather than solves the question. Others feel the idea subtly assumes a materialist worldview without adequately addressing deeper metaphysical concerns, such as why there is anything rather than nothing, or why the laws of physics exist in any form at all. In conclusion, the idea of the accidental universe offers a stark, fascinating, and at times unsettling vision of reality. It suggests that the cosmos is not the result of plan or purpose, but of cosmic coincidence on a grand scale. Whether embraced as a humbling truth or rejected as philosophically and emotionally unsatisfying, it challenges our deepest intuitions about order, meaning, and existence. And it raises one of the most profound questions we can ask: if the universe is accidental, what then do we choose to make of it? Existential absurdism. Existential absurdism is a provocative philosophical perspective that arises from a stark confrontation between the human need for meaning and the apparent indifference of the universe. It asserts that life is fundamentally absurd, not in the sense of being ridiculous, but in the sense of being incongruous, a mismatch between our deepest existential longings and a cosmos that offers no clear answers. While not necessarily nihilistic, absurdism forces us to face the unsettling idea that any search for inherent meaning, cosmic purpose, or divine order may ultimately be in vain. The idea is most closely associated with the 20th-century French-Algerian writer and philosopher Albert Camus, particularly in his 1942 essay The Myth of Sisyphus. Camus begins with a dramatic claim: there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. If life has no meaning, he asks, is it worth living? Rather than rushing to despair or blind faith, Camus invites us to examine the absurd directly, to acknowledge the contradiction between the human impulse to find meaning and the universe's cold silence in response. Camus describes absurdism as arising from a divorce between the human mind and the world. We seek clarity, coherence, and purpose, but the world offers randomness, decay, and death. Science explains how things work, not why. Religion may promise purpose, but often relies on unverifiable faith. Existentialism offers freedom but no fixed meaning. In the face of this vast indifference, absurdism sees no ultimate answer, and insists that we stop pretending otherwise. But absurdism does not end in hopelessness. Crucially, Camus argues that we must resist the temptation to escape the absurd through suicide or philosophical surrender, what he calls leaps of faith, like embracing religion or invented meaning just to soothe ourselves. Instead, he proposes a third option: revolt. The absurd hero does not deny the absurd, but defies it by living in spite of it. This is where the myth of Sisyphus becomes a metaphor for the absurd condition. Condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity only to watch it roll back down, Sisyphus seems to embody pointless labor. Yet Camus imagines Sisyphus happy, because he embraces his fate without illusion and continues on, defiantly. This idea of lucid defiance is the core of Camus' absurdist ethics. Life, though devoid of cosmic meaning, can still be filled with authentic experience, freedom, passion, and creativity. The absurd does not imprison us, it liberates us from false hopes and compels us to live honestly, without pretending that existence comes with built-in justification. Absurdism differs both from theism, which posits a divine source of meaning, and from nihilism, which denies all value entirely. It shares with existentialism the belief that individuals must construct meaning for themselves, but it is more skeptical than some existentialists, like Sartre, who believed in a kind of radical self-determination. Camus, for instance, does not claim we can create objective meaning, only that we can live with the absence of it, and still live well. Despite its appeal to intellectual honesty and resilience, absurdism remains controversial. Critics argue that it underestimates the richness of human connection, culture, and purpose-making. Others contend that it flirts too closely with despair, offering little comfort in times of suffering or grief. Religious thinkers often see it as a symptom of modern alienation, a worldview that cuts itself off from transcendence and spiritual hope. Still, absurdism has found resonance in literature, theater, film, and contemporary thought. From Franz Kafka's surreal stories to Samuel Beckett's tragicomic plays, the absurd becomes a lens through which to see the modern human condition, lost in a world without signposts, yet still striving. In today's age of information overload, existential crises, and planetary uncertainty, absurdism's challenge, to live fully without illusions, feels as urgent as ever. In conclusion, existential absurdism does not provide easy answers or comforting narratives. Instead, it offers a brutally honest but strangely empowering vision. That even in a world devoid of inherent meaning, we can find richness, joy, and dignity in the act of living. To live absurdly is to live awake, to see the void, and to sing anyway. Fatalism. Fatalism is a philosophical doctrine that holds that all events, past, present, and future, are fixed and inevitable, and that human beings are powerless to change the course of fate. According to fatalism, no matter what choices we make or how hard we try to alter the future, the outcome has already been determined. This idea strikes at the heart of human intuitions about free will, moral responsibility, and agency, making it one of the most controversial and unsettling perspectives in philosophy. At its core, fatalism asserts that the future is already written. If something is fated to happen, then it must happen, regardless of what anyone does. Unlike determinism, which claims that events are caused by prior conditions and natural laws, but might still allow for a meaningful role of human decision-making, fatalism implies that causation and effort are irrelevant to the outcome. The result will be the same, no matter what path is taken. This view has ancient roots. In Greek mythology and drama, the Moirai, or Fates, were three divine sisters who wove the destinies of gods and mortals alike. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, could not override the threads they spun. Tragic heroes like Oedipus or Achilles often struggle against their fates, only to fulfill them precisely through the very actions they took to avoid them. This motif conveys the fatalist belief that resistance is futile, not because of bad luck, but because the future is inescapably fixed. Philosophical fatalism appears in various forms. One version, known as logical fatalism, is based on the principle of bivalence, the idea that every proposition is either true or false. If it is already true today that a person will die in a car accident tomorrow, then how could that person possibly avoid it? If the statement is true now, the future event it describes must occur, and any attempt to change it would be futile. In this line of reasoning, the very concept of truth about the future seems to trap us in an inescapable destiny. Another form, theological fatalism, arises in religious contexts, especially within traditions that believe in an all-knowing, omnipotent deity. If God already knows everything that will happen, including all of our future actions, then how can we claim to act freely? If we could do otherwise, then God's knowledge would be fallible, contradicting divine omniscience. This leads to deep debates in theology and philosophy about whether divine foreknowledge is compatible with free will. Critics of fatalism argue that it rests on a confusion between inevitability and certainty. Just because something will happen does not mean it happens independently of our choices. In determinism, our actions do cause future outcomes, even if those outcomes are ultimately predictable. Fatalism, on the other hand, suggests that our actions are irrelevant, that the outcome will be the same no matter what. This distinction is important because determinism still allows for the idea that what we do matters. Fatalism denies this. Philosophers like Aristotle and David Hume have grappled with these issues, attempting to defend the role of reason and agency within a structured world. More recently, contemporary thinkers in logic and metaphysics have questioned the assumptions behind fatalist arguments, especially whether truths about the future necessitate the events they describe, or simply reflect a probability that becomes actual over time. Nevertheless, fatalism remains emotionally and existentially powerful. For some, it offers a kind of comfort, a way to accept suffering or failure by believing that everything happens for a reason, or that what is meant to be will be. In this way, fatalism sometimes blurs with stoicism or detached resignation, where peace is found in accepting what cannot be changed. For others, however, it is a deeply disempowering outlook, one that erodes responsibility, motivation, and the very meaning of choice. In conclusion, fatalism presents a radical challenge to our most cherished beliefs about freedom, agency, and control. It insists that the future is not open or influenced by our efforts, but already set in stone. Whether seen as a tragic truth, a comforting illusion, or a philosophical error, fatalism continues to provoke thought and debate across disciplines, asking us to consider how much power we really have over the shape of our lives. Postmodernism. Postmodernism is a complex and controversial philosophical movement that emerged in the mid-20th century as a reaction against the foundational ideas of modernism and the Enlightenment. It challenges the belief in objective truth, universal reason, progress, and stable meanings, ideas that had long underpinned Western thought. Instead, postmodernism embraces ambiguity, relativism, irony, and the idea that reality is constructed through language, culture, and power structures rather than discovered through rational inquiry. At its core, postmodernism is skeptical of grand narratives, those overarching stories that claim to explain everything about human history, society, or morality. Thinkers such as Jean-François Lyotard famously described postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives, arguing that totalizing ideologies, like Marxism, liberalism, or even scientific rationalism, are forms of power that impose a false coherence onto the messy, fragmented reality of human life. According to this view, claims to universal truth are often masks for cultural domination or exclusion. Postmodernism also radically rethinks language and meaning. Influenced by structuralist and post-structuralist theorists like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Roland Barthes, postmodernism argues that meaning is not fixed or stable. Words do not correspond neatly to reality but gain their meaning from their position within a shifting system of signs and cultural associations. Derrida's concept of deconstruction revealed how texts often contain internal contradictions and ambiguities that undermine their apparent coherence. This undermines the idea that authors control the meaning of their work or that readers can find a single, correct, interpretation. Michel Foucault, in particular, focused on how knowledge is inseparable from power. In his view, what societies accept as truth is not simply discovered through reason or observation but is shaped by institutions, discourse, and historical contingencies. Medical, legal, and scientific truths, for example, often reflect the power structures of the societies that produce them. For Foucault, prisons, schools, hospitals, and even psychiatry are not just neutral spaces of care or learning, they are tools for organizing and controlling human behavior through norms masked as objective knowledge. In the realm of art, architecture, and culture, postmodernism rejects the ideals of purity, simplicity, and progress that characterized modernism. Instead, it celebrates pastiche, irony, parody, and self-reference. A postmodern building might blend classical columns with neon signs and industrial steel, mocking the idea of a single, authentic, style. A postmodern novel might blur the line between fiction and reality, shift narrative voices unpredictably, or acknowledge the reader directly. This playful disruption of form and content reflects postmodernism's broader rejection of boundaries, between genres, disciplines, truth and fiction, even high and low culture. Critics of postmodernism often accuse it of relativism, nihilism, or intellectual irresponsibility. By denying the possibility of objective truth, they argue, postmodernism undermines the basis for rational debate, science, ethics, and social progress. If everything is a matter of perspective or discourse, how can we condemn injustice, pursue truth, or build a better society? Some argue that postmodernism provides convenient cover for authoritarianism or apathy. If all narratives are equally valid, then no one can be held accountable for their actions or beliefs. Defenders of postmodernism, however, argue that it does not promote cynicism or moral paralysis but offers a critical lens for questioning dominant assumptions. In a world saturated with media, ideology, and institutional bias, postmodernism provides tools to expose how knowledge is constructed and manipulated. It empowers marginalized voices by revealing that what is considered normal or universal is often the product of historical privilege. In literature, art, and politics, postmodernism opens space for diversity, difference, and creative subversion. In conclusion, postmodernism is not a single doctrine but a loose collection of ideas united by skepticism toward certainty, authority, and fixed meaning. It resists definition by its very nature, often turning its critiques on itself. Whether seen as a liberating response to the limitations of modernity or a dangerous descent into relativism and confusion, postmodernism continues to provoke debate across philosophy, politics, art, and culture. It invites us to question how we know what we know, who gets to decide what is true, and whether there is ever such a thing as a final answer.